Washington State with Chris Ferrara and Brian McCall. We are in June, the month of the Sacred Heart, when we attempt through the love of Christ to overcome the vice of pride.
Oh,
That took you a second.
here we are laughing again.
Right. Well, if you can't laugh, you would cry. But a lot of interesting things happened in the past few weeks, not least of which the jury came back in New York and found Trump guilty on 34 counts of recording a legal expense as a legal expense so as to election interfere.
Yeah, and proper bookkeeping.
Right.
Lock them up, throw away the key. What a joke. Everything about Trump seems to elicit from his enemies absolutely unprecedented attempts to destroy him. So this conviction represents the first and only trial of its kind in the history of common law, I would say, of anybody for any offense. This is the first time I've ever heard of a jury verdict that didn't have to be unanimous on the underlying predicate crimes, which leaves the reviewing courts unable to determine what it was they found Trump guilty of. Because, just to remind people, the misdemeanor offense, which lapsed long ago under the statute of limitations, was falsification of bookkeeping records. In this case, the claim, ridiculous as it is, that characterizing 34 checks written to a lawyer for his work was not a legal expense. Well, what would it be then? Is there a porn star drop-down menu in the accounting?
Yeah, I think that's what they were looking for, payments to porn stars. It's in Excel. I mean, it's a formula. It's right there.
Well, that expired. So what they did was they tried to tack it on to a felony. A felony occurs if you falsify the bookkeeping records, which were not falsified in the first place, in order to hide another crime. Well, what was the other crime? Take your choice, jury. Here's 3 choices. First choice, a violation of election law, which this state court had no jurisdiction to determine, right? And the second one was a conspiracy to thwart the election or steal the election by unlawful means. Well, what were the unlawful means? Well, that gets us back to the question, what was the predicate crime? And the third choice was basically the predicate crime was bookkeeping offense. So the falsification of records, which is a misdemeanor, is turned into a felony by the underlying crime of falsification of business records. A totally circular jury charge. And then, of course, he was denied the right to bring forth an expert on federal election law who would have said there's no election law violation here. Anyway, everyone seems to think that at some point in the appellate process, this preposterous, made-up criminal offense will be undone, if not by the appellate division or the Court of Appeals in the United States Supreme Court, because there are obvious constitutional issues here. First of which is a non-unanimous jury verdict in a criminal case. Really?
Well, I mean, really, the jury instructions were essentially, if you want him to go to jail, vote guilty on whatever theory you want to use.
Yeah, or as Babylon Bee put it, the judge instructs jury that they need not find Trump guilty in order to convict him.
Right.
That's not even a satire. That is actually true.
Yeah.
They need not unanimously find Trump guilty of any of the underlying predicate crimes in order to convict him of falsifying business records to hide an underlying predicate crime. So there's a fundamental lack of unanimity.
I mean, I think you're right. There are obviously multiple grounds on which this could be overturned. The constitutional issue you mentioned, the lack of being able to bring expert witnesses, allowing prejudicial, irrelevant testimony of the prosecution in, the obvious bias of the judge. But this isn't a normal case. So, I mean, do you really think the court is going to overturn this? Or is they're so deranged in New York that they're going to uphold even this?
I don't hold out much hope for the First Department Appellate Division.
Okay.
Court of Appeals has enough residual integrity that you could get a 4-3 out of them, or a 5-4 if you get what the composition of that court is. I think it's 7 or 9, but it would be a 1-vote margin at best. But I think there's enough integrity there because look what they did in the Weinstein case by 4-3. Yeah, it was 4-3.
Yeah.
In the Weinstein case, they said he was denied his right to testify because the judge said, just as the judge did in this case, that if he gets on the witness stand, he will be impeached by every bad thing he's ever done. That's what Marchand said here. He said if Trump takes the stand, you can impeach him with everything. Not only the Hollywood Access tape, which was let in for no good reason,
Right.
but all the other allegations of all the other women that he did this, that, or the other thing, none of which panned out. So he was precluded from taking the stand. They reversed the Weinstein conviction in the Court of Appeals in New York.
Mm.
So on that basis, Trump should get a reversal for that reason alone. But then we have all the other constitutional violations, such as the non-unanimous jury verdict on the predicate crime. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's not, people see through it. No one really takes the conviction seriously. The Democrats celebrate it because, well, they got what they wanted, but they know it's nonsense. There was a commentator for CNN who basically said this is a bespoke crime. In other words, a crime custom tailored for Trump that no one else has ever been charged with. Now, when a CNN analyst says that, you know that at somewhere along the line there has to be a reversal. But perhaps they know that. All they really care about is they've got a conviction. Now he's going to be sentenced on July 11th. So what if he gets sentenced to house arrest?
Well, could he be sentenced to actual jail? I mean, do you think that's a possibility?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Probably not, though, because he's a first offender. The judge can consider anything he wants for sentencing, including all the prejudicial material. I don't think he would dare sentence Trump to Rikers Island, which is where you go if the sentence is less than a year. Mm-hmm. And you're certainly not going to sentence Trump to more than a year. Could he sentence him to house arrest? Very possibly, although I doubt even that would fly because that would get an immediate stay motion in the appellate division, then an immediate stay motion in the Court of Appeals, staying the sentence, and then on to the United States Supreme Court. And I think they've had quite enough at the Supreme Court of these ridiculous attempts to keep Trump from running for office. That's all this is. They've already basically shot down the idea that you could keep him off the ballot in the different states that tried it, including Colorado. They're pretty much fed up with Jack Smith, as we can see, with his fake charges. It looks like the Section 1512 obstruction of official proceeding element of the convictions of the J6 people is going down the tubes. And with that goes down the tubes a big part of the Trump case brought by Jack Smith. Eileen Cannon in Florida, in the Southern District, has set up a huge hearing on June 21st just to determine whether Jack Smith was even validly appointed in the first place. And she's invited amicus curiae, friends of the court, to participate in this massive hearing on June 21st. So there's no chance that either of Jack Smith's cases are going to trial.
And then Georgia. Yeah, speaking about
Georgia, forget Georgia. The Georgia Court of Appeals has stayed every one of the trials of the 19 defendants in that moron Fannie Willis's RICO case, so that they can decide whether the same moron should be bounced off the case after obviously lying through her teeth on the witness stand, along with her perjured boyfriend who lied through his teeth. So when they stay the trials until October 6th, which is the date of oral argument on whether Fannie the boob should be disqualified, they're really basically saying she's going to be disqualified.
Yeah.
And once she's disqualified, her whole office is gone. So they would have to start the case over again. They're not going to. The whole case is a joke anyway. They're trying to turn an election challenge into a felony based on RICO, another ridiculous, unprecedented application of the criminal law. So things are looking good for Trump, no matter what they try to do with these bogus criminal cases.
Well, again, maybe their objective is to distract him. They have him tied up in New York for 2 weeks. I mean, he's campaigning from the defense table, essentially, for several weeks.
There could be a house arrest. That's what worries me.
Yeah.
And here's another moving part. Let's assume Hunter Biden, in his gun charge trial, which is just about to conclude next week, let's assume he gets convicted. And the judge, in a show of leniency, says, well, I can't really give you a term of incarceration. I'll take into consideration your drug addiction. So you're under house arrest for 3 years. Well, then Marshawn can say, well, I'll put Trump under house arrest for 3 years, which means he can't leave his house without permission to campaign. Now, that would be such an outrageous interference with an election process based on a made-up criminal offense that no one has ever seen before that I think very quickly the Supreme Court would be asked to intervene, and that it would intervene. I mean, we need to preserve the electoral process in this country from this kind of attack. We've never seen anything like this before. The Supreme Court knows what's going on here. So if they do put him under house arrest, well, there probably would be an emergency application to the court. And I think he has a decent shot at getting the sentence stayed, at least, if not overturned, before the Supreme Court, if not sooner.
But do you think he could go straight to the U.S. Supreme Court, or would he have to run through the New York?
I think his best shot is that. Well, there's also the federal track.
Yeah.
Now, there's an exception under the younger abstention doctrine. This is a doctrine where federal courts will abstain to state court criminal proceedings, unless under the Dombrowski case and other precedents, those proceedings are brought in bad faith, in which case there's an option. Federal court has the option not to abstain and to enjoin the federal prosecution. So that's a track that they could pursue. I don't see what they have to lose, because that's another way to get to the Supreme Court right away. If this is not a bad faith prosecution, a made up offense with no unanimous jury verdict required, then there is no such thing as a bad faith prosecution. So they might go right to the federal track and take that issue all the way up to the Supreme Court very rapidly.
No, you're right. The other Babylon Bee satire, that's not really satire, headline was Trump was convicted of being Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's, of course. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows it. The liberals know it. At least 5 justices of the Supreme Court know exactly what's going on here. Eileen Cannon knows it in Florida. Yeah. And the Court of Appeals in Georgia, they know exactly what's going on here. They're trying to take Trump out of the race with made-up, phony charges based on basically protected activity.
So let me ask another question that I've seen batted around by some people, speculative. So let's assume he wins the presidency. Is he able to pardon himself from all of these things and get rid of them that way?
Never been decided by the United States Supreme Court. That's another case that's going to go right before them, and very quickly, because they'll be faced with the prospect of him, if he gets convicted of any of these ridiculous charges in the end, if they're not all overturned, of a president convicted by some penny ante local prosecutor and being asked to report to jail in some county somewhere in Georgia, Fulton County. So the Supreme Court would have to consider whether a president can pardon himself. Seems logical. He can pardon everybody in the world. Why can't he pardon himself?
Now, can he pardon himself?
If it's a federal offense.
That's what I was going to say. Can he pardon himself of the New York?
No.
No.
That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
But there are other avenues to attack that, which would be policy decisions that a court would have to get involved in. Can you imprison a duly elected United States president during the term of his office if he has been duly elected by the voters? Does a local prosecutor have the power to basically, if you don't like the man who was elected, indict him on something, quickly try him during his 4-year term, and then demand that he report to jail in some outlying county somewhere? Yeah. There has to be a policy decision by the Supreme Court. Otherwise, we have a mechanism now, a permanently operative mechanism by which Democrat prosecutors and everyone involved in all of these shady prosecutions as a Democrat can bring down any Republican president they like by indicting him for something.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It used to be a kind of prisoner's dilemma kept politicians from doing this stupid thing. Right. Well, if I do this, they'll do it to me. And there's it's sort of mutual assured destruction. But they seem to be so deranged that they even threw that concern out the window. Yeah.
Yeah, the prisoner's dilemma is a great way of putting it.
Yeah, pun intended.
And that's why I think, confronted with the prisoner's dilemma, they're going to have to do something, if not on constitutional grounds, certainly as a matter of policy. I mean, that's where it seems to be going, by the way, with the immunity case before the Supreme Court. There's going to be a policy decision saying we must have as a constitutional policy under the separation of powers doctrine some limited immunity for presidents, so that not every Tom, Dick, and Harry who calls himself a prosecutor can indict a president whenever he feels like on some local offense. But then they have to figure out what acts of a president are subject to that immunity. My view is that anything a president has the authority to do is subject to the immunity. If he has the authority to say the election was fixed and order an investigation, everything he did in that regard should be subject to immunity.
Sure. Well, this is certainly not going to end in November with the election, as you say. There's lots of unprecedented situations and issues.
World War III, too, because now Biden is sleepwalking us into World War III. We're firing missiles into Russian territory, American-made missiles.
Hmm.
I'm sure we already have American advisors on the ground. The French have advisors on the ground in Ukraine. We're going to bring the world to the brink of a European, if not a world war, because of a dispute over some eastern portions of Ukraine that were traditionally Russian territory anyway.
Hmm.
Utterly insane. But they need the war. It's a wag the dog scenario.
Well,
Got to
again,
have a war.
they dishonored the veterans on D-Day to making D-Day commemorations just earlier this week about Ukraine once again. But
Yeah.
speaking of bizarre, like to try to help us square a circle here when it comes to Pope Francis. So he hits the news about a week ago because a meeting he had with the Italian bishops in private, closed doors, but with all the Italian bishops, where he basically starts ranting about homosexuals in the seminaries and they need to not be allowed in, even if they have the slightest tendency towards homosexuality. He then calls these people by a rude name that, if we mention on this platform, will get probably censored for. But it's an English word for a cigarette with otri at the end. And again, then the news media goes crazy. How can he
The
say
bundle of
these?
sticks.
Exactly. News media goes crazy. How can he say this? This is so homophobic. Then, lo and behold, just a few days later, he gets a letter from a former seminarian, 22-year-old man, Italian, Lorenzo Michel Noe Coruso, who writes to him and says he was in the seminary and got kicked out for living a homosexual lifestyle. And he writes to him on May 28th. 3 days later, he gets a handwritten letter back from the Pope. Now, you've tried to contact popes before. You've tried to pursue Father Gruner's case, for example. Do you ever get a letter back from the Pope in 3 days
Never gotten a letter back from the Pope at
at
all.
all? Yeah. Well,
No matter how much we tried.
this guy somehow gets a handwritten letter back 3 days later, which basically says Jesus calls everyone. Everyone. I'm quoting the English translation. Some think of the church as a customs office. This is bad. The church must be open to everyone. Brother, go ahead with your vocation. But wait, I thought he just said they can't be in the seminary, but he should go ahead with his vocation.
Are we surprised at this point?
Well,
This
so
is this is
are,
the way the man operates.
will the real Bergoglio please stand up? I mean, which do you think he is?
Well, we know what he is. He'll always say something conservative, then he'll undermine it with something liberal. Then he'll say something else that's vaguely conservative. He'll undermine that with a liberal gesture. And always the direction is toward the theological left, if you want to call it that. Always the direction is toward neo-modernist outcomes. That's his modus operandi. He'll feint to the right, for want of a better term, only to go back to the left. One step, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The old communist strategy. So he takes the 1 step back, but he's already taken 2 steps forward.
Hmm,
So the letter is the second step forward.
hmm,
He'll say something about how the seminary should be basically barred to people who are subject to this depraved inclination, as the Catechism calls it. But then he'll tell someone who was kicked out for that very reason, according to his advice,
right.
forget his advice. Go back into the seminary. Now, what's the seminary going to do? They're going to have to readmit him. So this is the Pope we've had to live with for well on 13, 14 years now.
Hmm.
And his modus operandi has remained unchanged from the beginning. Say one thing, do another, do one thing, say another, on and on and on. Affirm what you deny what you affirm. That's the modernist method. That's the Bergoglian method. That's the method of politics in Argentina.
Well, at the root of modernism is the denial of the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot be and not be in the same sense at the same time, but he wants to sort of deny that. I can be homophobic and homophilic at the same time, essentially.
Well,
Which, yeah.
someone of a very mainstream orientation said this at least 7 years ago, that this pontificate is a danger to the integrity of the faith. This is a very mainstream figure. I won't embarrass him by quoting him. Someone who would be very critical of traditionalists, by the way, but hasn't been heard to criticize us lately. He said this pontificate is a threat to the faith. Well, we know that now. All the more, we know it in spades. And this is a typical example of what this Pope does. He has been undermining the integrity of the faith, specifically in the area of morality, above all else, and liturgy from the day he was elected. Absolutely staggering development. Normally we laugh at these things. We're not laughing today.
Well, and interesting, the part I skipped at the beginning of the handwritten letter, he first launches into an attack on clericalism. Clericalism is the reason you were kicked out of the seminary. It's this horrible attitude in the church. So, how is it that he equates just doctrinal orthodoxy with this so-called clericalism?
Well, his notion of clericalism is the idea that priests are members of the clergy. That's what he
Right.
No, and we see a broader problem here. We see, again, I mentioned this before. Romano Amerio talks about it, which is the loss of essences in post-conciliar thinking. What do I mean by the loss of essences? Well, basically, the loss of categories, the distinction between one thing and another, between the priesthood and the laity, between right and wrong conduct, between heterosexuality and homosexuality in terms of the seriousness of an offense committed by one or the other outside of marriage. All distinctions are blurred in this man's mind until we arrive at a situation in which there is no distinction between truth and falsehood itself, which is the end goal of modernism. There is no truth. Everything is relativized. We have a relativistic neo-modernist pope. There's just no getting around that.
Well, combined with this letter to this poor Italian man, the same week as well, he pens a preface to a book by the infamous Jesuit James Martin called Come Forth Lazarus, where he basically says the miracle of the raising of Lazarus is really to show that sin should be welcomed and our Lord accepted people even though they were, quote, dead to sin. More or less, that's the theme of his book. And Francis praised the Jesuitical methods and great insights and love of James Martin, a person who's done nothing but undermine the doctrine of the faith.
Well, of course, the church always says, in the sense of Lazarus, come forth into the new life in which you are translated into the state of grace through baptism. And if you are already baptized and have fallen, through confession and the restoration of your state of grace. That's the true meaning of Lazarus come forth. Father Martin's meaning is we accept sinners as they are, as rotting carcasses, because that's what you become when you're not in a state of grace. It happens to any one of us if we fall. We don't say we're superior to the sinner. We say God is infinitely superior to any one of us, and it's only through the operation of his grace that any of us becomes anything resembling a human being. So when you cast off the helps of the church, when you're not living a sacramental life, when you're living in a state of sin, when you're committing acts of grave depravity, as the Catechism still says, you are Lazarus in the tomb. You cannot be brought to life again unless and until you repent of whatever sin it is you're committing, a mortal sin that has deprived you of the state of grace. But not according to Father Martin. Nope, we just accept them the way they are. It's an absolute perversion of the call to conversion.
Well, essentially, he wants to change our Lord's word to the woman caught in adultery,
Right.
Go and sin no more, to go and sin some more.
Yeah, go and sin some more. As I've said before in one of our broadcasts, when the disciples heard this, they said among themselves, this is an easy saying. Who can reject it?
Right. But ultimately, that's what the modernists have wanted in the church since the Vatican II, is an easier church, a church that makes no requirements, that basically says not just the church is open to all, but everybody can come in no matter what, that there's no cost to admission. There's nothing, you don't have to change anything. You don't have to change your life. You don't have to.
Why bother? What do we need the church for?
Right. Well, because some people might feel a little guilty. They want to ease their conscience, and the church can be there to tell them it's all right.
Yeah, well, the church can tell them it's all right without them ever becoming Catholics, which in fact is what the church is doing right now.
Yeah.
Everybody, I'm okay, you're okay, whatever religion you have, it's copacetic with the man upstairs. So, total religious indifferentism has taken over, which, by the way, was a prediction of Pius XI in Mortalium Animos, that if you follow the ecumenical movement to its logical conclusion, you abandon revealed religion altogether. And you just end up with this vague, this is the essence of modernism, by the way, this vague religious sense that everybody has, which leads each person to his version of the truth, and all these roads lead to God. So why do we need the Catholic Church? Well, we don't, except to tell everybody that they're all on a road to salvation. So we proclaim the new version of the good news. I'm okay, you're okay. You take your road, I'll take my road.
Well, and then following Pius XI, Pius XII said, I'll paraphrase another quote in front of me, but I'm troubled by the message of Lucia Fatima, the suicide of the church changing her doctrine, changing her liturgy. He clearly, Pius XII, saw what potentially was coming if the church went down this
I
path.
remember that quote. It came in the biography of Pius XII
Yes,
by Monsignor Roche.
yes,
And the quote, I'm almost quoting it verbatim. I am worried by
yes.
the messages of Sister Lucia Fatima. The message of Fatima is a warning against the suicide that would be
Mm,
represented by altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her
mm,
soul. I
yes.
see all around me innovators who wish to make the church feel remorse for her historical past. And then he said, this is all in the biography, the day will come when you will enter the sanctuary and you will say, where have they taken him?
Mm,
They've taken the sanctuary, they've taken the Blessed Sacrament and moved it into a room somewhere. It's a pretty chilling prophecy, and we've seen all of that come to pass. That's not a laughing matter, even though we find ourselves laughing at it. And by the way, speaking of laughter, let's talk a little bit about. Some people say, "Why are you laughing all the time?" I just saw a little piece, a little snippet of something by Jordan Peterson, and he says, "We laugh at something we hear, even though we think we shouldn't laugh, because it hits us very hard
mm,
at a place in our psyche where truth is found. And our instinctive reaction to the impact on that truth is to laugh out loud." Now, that happens with a joke.
mhm,
Some jokes make us laugh. We laugh when we shouldn't laugh because it might not be appropriate in given circumstances. But it's an involuntary kind of reflexive reaction, but a reaction to a truth. So
mm,
when we see something utterly absurd and offensive in the church, sometimes the reaction is just to laugh out loud at it. How can this be?
mm,
Because we know that we've seen this happening, and what we see impacts. I guess we have a deposit of truths in our souls, and when the impact occurs, our reaction is to laugh at it because it's
mm,
just so intolerably absurd. So in a way, laughter relieves us and vindicates the
mm.
truth that we see by laughing at the error that we encounter.
Well, if that's true, 2024 gives us a lot of reasons to
Oh,
laugh.
we'll be laughing hysterically.
Yeah. We'll be laughing into 2025.
And
Yeah,
Daniel Peterson said something else. We could be in a situation where the only one telling the truth is the jester, because the
uh,
jester points out the failings of those in power, and his laughter reduces them to shame because he's exposing their folly.
well,
So
that's
there's
it.
a role for
If
that.
I were elected president, my first act would be to establish a new court jester for the United States.
We certainly can use a court jester in the current White House.
That's for sure. Oh, we have one. No, wait, he's the president. Sorry.
That's right.
Well, there you go. There we have confusion in church and state. Another sign of an interesting year. But let's do our part. And so don't forget the Fatima Center 100 by 100 challenge to do as many first Saturdays as you can in response to Our Lady's request. Great. Well, it was good laughing with you, Chris, and look forward to laughing again in 2 weeks.
We'll have increasingly intense episodes of this series as the year progresses, I'm sure. You think we've seen unprecedented things already? Wait till you see what's coming up in the next 6 months.
See you soon.
Take care. God bless.